And the honourable member for Mississauga, Streetsville.
Mr. Speaker, on May 16, 2017, the Minister of Transport introduced Bill C-49, the Transportation Modernization Act, to bring our government's vision of a state-of-the-art national transportation system to fruition. All Canadians want their transportation system to be safe and secure, green and innovative, while supporting economic growth and the creation of jobs for Canada's middle class. Bill C-49 meets all of these objectives, as well as the government's commitment to develop a fair, accessible, reliable and efficient transportation system for 2030 and beyond. One very important element of this bill is the proposal for strengthened air passenger rights, which would be reinforced by regulations. As more Canadians use their air transportation, thanks to increased services and lower fares, recent events at home and abroad have demonstrated the need for strengthened rights for air travelers. Canadian travelers want to know that when they purchase an airline ticket, their air carrier will in fact provide the services that they have purchased. If the air carrier cannot deliver the purchased services, then the traveler must be provided with a certain standard of treatment. And in some cases, the traveler must receive compensation from the air carrier. Canadian travelers also expect that they should not have to fly to get the service for which they have paid. As such, air passenger rights must be easy to understand and apply consistently to all airlines, domestic and international. They must apply to all flights from and within Canada and benefit all travelers. Should Bill C-49 receive royal assent, the Canadian Transportation Agency would be mandated, in collaboration with Transport Canada, to develop a set of clear regulations to ensure a consistent framework for air passenger rights applicable to all carriers. As our government is committed to ensuring this regulatory process moves forward in an open and expeditious manner, further consultations will take place with stakeholders throughout Canada. The regulations would enshrine standards of care and compensations in a variety of situations faced by air travelers. The regulations would address some of the more frequent irritants, such as providing passengers with clear and concise information about air carriers' obligations and how to seek compensation or file complaints, establishing standards of treatment for passengers in cases of denied boarding, delays and cancellations, including compensation for inconvenience in situations of overbooking, standardizing compensation levels for lost or damaged baggage on both domestic and international flights, developing clear standards for the treatment of passengers in the case of tarmac delays, ensuring children under 14 years of age are seated in proximity to a parent or a guardian at no extra charge, and requiring air carriers to define their policies on the carriage of musical instruments. Canada is not alone in legislating or regulating specific practices of the airline industry by establishing a framework of passenger rights. Other countries have developed guidelines or regulations to ensure that passengers receive a standard level of treatment or compensation when their flight is delayed or cancelled. This government, however, is committed to establishing air passenger rights that would make our country a world leader in how such irritants are to be addressed. For instance, under the regulations that would be developed for air passenger rights, provisions would be included to ensure that no passenger can be involuntarily removed from an aircraft after they have boarded as a result of overbooking. If the airline cannot find a volunteer to give up their seat, they will need to pay compensation to remedy this inconvenience that they have caused. This is a commitment that the Minister of Transport has made and that the government intends to fulfill. Bill C-49 seeks a balanced approach as it relates to air passenger rights, one that would ensure the passenger is treated fairly, but also one that would allow the air carrier to operate its business in a manner such that it can remain competitive and profitable. For example, the legislation clearly outlines that the requirement for compensation would be utilized only in instances where the air carrier is directly responsible for the denial of boarding, delay or cancellation of the flight. While recognizing that overbooking is a standard practice, which allows air carriers to keep their ticket prices low, passengers who are denied boarding should receive fair compensation when this occurs. This level of compensation would be clearly enshrined in regulations. This government, however, recognizes that the carriers operate in a complex environment and that there are significant costs associated with safety and security, both in the air and on the ground. Increased competition and pressure from consumers for lower ticket costs has also resulted in a more complex business model for air carriers. There are also factors that are outside an air carrier's control, such as weather or medical emergencies, that may result in a flight being delayed or canceled. We recognize that these factors must be taken into account when developing an air passenger's Bill of Rights. That said, in cases where a flight is delayed for reasons that are beyond an air carrier's control, such as weather delays, passengers have a right to be provided a standard level of treatment, including ongoing communication by the air carrier. Further, C-49 also contains provisions to increase data collection from air carriers and others in the air travel sector. This would allow the government to measure air carriers' compliance with the regulations and to take corrective action if needed. Both government and air carriers can learn from this data, allowing for decisions to be based on solid evidence. In closing, should Bill C-49 receive royal assent, Canadian travelers can look forward to strengthened provisions that would better protect their rights. These passenger rights will ensure that Canadians are entitled to a world-leading standard of treatment and compensation. For these reasons, I ask my honourable colleagues to support Bill C-49 to enshrine air passenger rights for Canadians. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire? The Honourable Parliament Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the comments from my colleague. And maybe if he can just provide some additional thoughts in terms of just how important it is that the legislation that we're debating today. We went through the committee process. We had the government always looking for ways in which it can improve upon legislation. Had a number of amendments that were actually brought forward. Many of those amendments actually came from the Conservative Party that were ultimately successful. What we have today is a good piece of legislation. I know from my own personal point of view that many of the residents I represent were fairly anxious to see action on the idea of an air passenger's Bill of Rights. So it's finally something after years of actually hearing virtually nothing, that we have something that's tangible. We're moving forward, and this is good news for those that travel through our airlines. And I wonder if my colleague could just provide his thoughts in terms of his opinion on just how important it is that we move forward on the legislation.
Honourable Member for Mississauga-Streetsville.
I'd like to thank my colleague for his question. The transportation system is very vast, it's very complicated, and it's of national importance to Canadians. And as was suggested, I do sit on the Transportation Committee. I was very pleased that we worked quite collaboratively and adopted at least 6 of 9 of the amendments. We also did come back a week early. The process was very smooth, it went well, and I think Canadians will benefit from this collaboration from all sides of the House.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The Honourable Member for Sarnia-Lambton.
I thank the member opposite for his speech. Now, in terms of the compensation that people will receive when they have some kind of a travel fiasco, as I understand it, the legislation calls for them to sort out whether or not it was the airline's fault or weather or another government agency. And so I'm concerned about the administrative burden that this will put for every single claim that, that those kind of things will have to be proven. And does the member have any idea of how much additional resource will be needed to address this administrative burden?
The Honourable Member for Mississauga-Streetsville.
Again, I'd like to thank my colleague for the question. The legislation that comes forward would further stipulate any recourse, but in terms of the operations of air carriers in relation to those of the consumer, we can't burden air carriers for things that they're not responsible for. For example, as mentioned in my speech, we can't hold an air carrier to account if there's an act of weather or a security risk on the ground. They're going to be responsible only for those situations that they're directly responsible for. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Qu'est-ce commentaire? The honourable member for Central Nova.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his remarks, which I note focused primarily on the Air Passenger Bill of Rights. I know he sat through many days of testimony as one of my committee colleagues, and I'd like to ask him about a different portion of the bill. I know the member is from Ontario, and when it came to the transportation for freight rail, one of the things that was a key feature of this bill was long-haul interswitching. Previously, there was a regime in place that pertained only to the transportation of Western Canadian grain. Under C-49, the bill expands to different industries in different parts of the country. I'm wondering, being from a different part of the country, if he sees the value in this extended long-haul interswitching as opposed to the simple regime that was in place simply for Western Canadian grain previously.
Honourable member for Mississauga Streetsville.
I'd like to thank my colleague for his question. As I just previously stated, our transportation system is very vast. It's of national importance, and the previous bill didn't take all of this into account. What we've put forward now is of the greatest good for the greatest number of people, and what it certainly does is create a lot more competition, which will help everybody in the industry. Thank you.
Resuming debate, and the